Ladies and gentlemen, listen to me very carefully, because the deepest wounds in love are rarely caused by what was said out loud. They are caused by what was never understood in silence. The person who cannot move on from you is not always in love with your name, your face, or even your touch. Sometimes they are trapped by something far more dangerous. They are trapped by the version of themselves that only existed when you were near. They are trapped by the part of their soul that woke up beside you and then refused to go back to sleep. And that is why they cannot let you go. Not because you were simply beautiful, not because you were simply kind, not because you were simply rare, but because your presence did something that altered their inner world, and now that inner world will not stop calling your name. This is the truth many people never want to face. When someone cannot move on from you, it is not always because you gave them the greatest love of their life. Sometimes it is because you gave them the greatest mirror of their life. You did not just enter their story. You exposed their story. You did not just become a lover, a friend, a partner, a memory. You became a revelation. You showed them what they were capable of feeling. You showed them what they were capable of losing. You showed them how deep their hunger really was. And once a human being has seen that kind of depth, they can never again pretend that shallow things are enough. They say, "I miss you," but often what they really mean is, "I miss who I was when you looked at me like I mattered." They say, "I cannot forget you," but what they are really confessing is, "I cannot forget the intensity, the safety, the chaos, the meaning, the possibility you awakened in me." And that is why moving on is never as simple as deleting a number, blocking a profile, or pretending the heart has no memory. The heart remembers the place where it was cracked open. The soul remembers the first person who made it feel both exposed and alive. The mind can lie, the ego can posture, but the deeper self remembers everything. Ladies and gentlemen, Carl Jung taught us something that the modern world keeps trying to ignore. Human beings do not only fall in love with each other, they also fall in love with projections. They project their longing, their unmet needs, their hidden wounds, their unlived possibilities, and their secret dreams onto another person. In the beginning, this feels like destiny. It feels electric. It feels like a collision of souls. But in truth, much of that fire comes from recognition. Not always recognition of the other person as they truly are, but recognition of something inside oneself that has finally found a shape. That is why some bonds feel impossible to forget, because the other person was never only a person. They were a door. They were a doorway into your own unconscious. And this is where the pain begins, because once the projection is broken, the reality can be unbearable. The person who cannot move on from you may not actually miss the full reality of you. They may miss the fantasy, the hope, the emotional refuge, the meaning they attach to you. They may miss the way you made them feel seen, desired, understood, forgiven, challenged, awakened, or even wounded. They may miss the psychological experience of being close to you more than they miss the practical reality of sharing a life. That is why the memory lingers. That is why the mind returns. That is why, even after time passes, a song, a place, a scent, a particular hour of the day can bring everything back in a single breath. Because what you awaken in someone does not vanish just because the relationship ends. The unconscious does not obey convenience. The unconscious does not say, "The conversation is over, therefore the feeling is over." No. The unconscious holds on to what was intense, what was unfinished, what was emotionally charged, what was never fully integrated. And when a person has not done the inner work to understand what you represented in their life, they remain stuck in a loop. They think they are missing you, but often they are actually missing the meaning they attach to you. They are missing the emotional story more than the actual person. That is the real reason they cannot move on. When you entered their life, you may have touched something they had spent years avoiding. Maybe you brought tenderness into a place that had only known neglect. Maybe you brought honesty into a life built on masks. Maybe you brought depth into a world that preferred surface-level comfort. Maybe you brought truth to someone who survived by hiding. And when that happens, the soul reacts. It recognizes both medicine and danger. Because healing is beautiful, but healing is also terrifying. To be seen is to be known. To be known is to be vulnerable. To be vulnerable is to risk loss. And many people would rather suffer in familiarity than face the terror of transformation. That is why so many people do not move on. They do not move on because the bond was never merely romantic. It was psychological. It touched the architecture of their identity. You may have become the person who made them question everything they thought they knew about love, loyalty, trust, and self-worth. You may have become the one who revealed the wound they had buried for years. You may have awakened desire in a heart that had become numb. You may have awakened conscience in a mind that had learned to rationalize emptiness. And once a person encounters that kind of awakening, the memory becomes difficult to bury because it is no longer just a memory, it is an encounter with truth. And truth is heavy. People often say that they miss the relationship, but what they really miss is the emotional charge. They miss the arguments because the arguments meant intensity. They miss the peace because the peace meant safety. They miss the future they imagined because that future gave structure to their fantasies. They miss the way you responded to them because your responses gave them an identity. In your presence, they knew who they were supposed to be. In your absence, they are forced to ask who they really are. And that question is the one most people avoid for years, because once they ask it honestly, they discover that what they had called love was sometimes only a temporary rescue from inner emptiness. There is a reason the shadow is such an important idea in Jung's psychology. The shadow is not just evil. It is everything in us that we refuse to see, refuse to admit, refuse to own. It is our jealousy, our neediness, our fear, our hunger, our dependency, our pride, our tenderness, our longing, our wounds, our capacity for both cruelty and devotion. And when you enter someone's life and bring that shadow to the surface, they may fall in love with you and resent you at the same time. They may adore you and fear you at the same time. They may chase you and push you away at the same time. Because you are no longer just a person to them. You are the mirror that showed them a self they were not ready to meet. This is why some people are haunted after you leave. Not because they were broken beyond repair, but because you revealed the brokenness that was already there. You did not create the wound. You exposed it. You touched it. You illuminated it. And sometimes illumination hurts more than the injury itself. A person can live for years inside a lie if the lie is comfortable. But the moment someone like you arrives and disrupts the illusion, the ego panics. The ego does not like being dethroned. It does not like admitting it was wrong. It does not like losing control. So instead of healing, it clings. Instead of understanding, it denies. Instead of releasing, it obsesses. And that obsession is often mistaken for love. But obsession and love are not the same thing. Love seeks truth. Obsession seeks possession. Love allows the other person to become real. Obsession tries to freeze them in time. Love accepts change. Obsession resists the passage of time because it cannot tolerate the death of a fantasy. When someone cannot move on from you, there is often a war inside them between reality and fantasy. Reality says the relationship is over. Fantasy says the bond still lives. Reality says time has passed. Fantasy says the feeling remains. Reality says the door is closed. Fantasy keeps returning to the doorway. And as long as that war continues, the person remains emotionally trapped. What makes this even more painful is that many people never confess the real reason they are stuck. They will say they miss your smile, your laugh, your voice, your kindness. Those things may be true, but underneath all of it lies something deeper. They miss the way your existence challenged their inner emptiness. They miss the way you made them believe in a version of life that felt more vivid, more meaningful, more alive. They miss the part of themselves that only emerged when you were near. And that is why replacement does not work. Another person cannot simply take your place, because the place you occupied was not merely relational. It was symbolic. It was emotional. It was psychological. You became a symbol of possibility. To one person, you may have represented safety. To another, you represented danger. To another, you represented home. To another, you represented a future they secretly wanted, but were too afraid to build. To another, you represented the ideal they had always longed for, but never found the courage to choose. And because symbols are powerful, they do not vanish easily. They live in dreams, in triggers, in regrets, in midnight thoughts, in moments of loneliness, in silent drives home, in places where nobody is looking. That is where your memory survives, not only in their conscious mind, but in the architecture of their unconscious. This is why people keep checking, keep wondering, keep returning mentally, even after they have physically left. The body may be absent, but the psyche has not accepted the loss. The psyche says, there is unfinished business here. The heart says, there is something I never understood. The ego says, I need to know whether I mattered. And when a person does not receive closure or cannot create closure within themselves, the mind keeps reopening the wound in search of an answer. That is why they cannot move on from you. They are not only grieving the relationship, they are grieving the unanswered questions that the relationship left behind. Did I matter? Did I lose something real? Did I sabotage something beautiful? Did I confuse fear for indifference? Did I run away from the very thing that could have healed me? Did I lose the one person who saw me clearly? These are not small questions. These are identity-shaping questions. They force a person to evaluate not only what they lost, but who they were when they lost it. And that is a painful mirror indeed, because sometimes the reason they cannot move on is not that they are still emotionally attached to you in a healthy sense. It is that they cannot forgive themselves for what they became when fear took control. There are people who lose you and then begin to understand your value. They begin to understand your patience after they have exhausted it. They begin to understand your loyalty after they have taken it for granted. They begin to understand your depth after they have settled for shallow connections. They begin to understand your consistency after they have spent months or years surrounded by inconsistency. And the irony is brutal. The moment they truly understand what you were, they no longer have you. That realization can become a prison. Because now, every memory is sharpened by regret. Every ordinary moment is reinterpreted as precious. Every missed opportunity becomes a wound that never fully closes. And yet, even here, Jung would remind us that the task is not to remain captive to regret. The task is to make meaning from it. The task is to understand why that person entered your life, why you entered theirs, and what was revealed in the exchange. Because every profound relationship contains a psychological lesson. Some people arrive to love us. Some arrive to awaken us. Some arrive to test our boundaries. Some arrive to reveal our unhealed patterns. Some arrive to show us our own hidden dignity. Some arrive as mirrors. Some arrive as teachers. Some arrive as warnings. And some arrive as unfinished chapters that only life can close. But until the lesson is understood, the attachment persists. The real reason they cannot move on from you may be that you activated their inner hunger for wholeness. You became a glimpse of what integration could feel like. In your presence, they sensed that their fragmented self could be arranged into something more complete. They sensed that their lonely child, their guarded adult, their wounded heart, their ambitious ego, their ashamed shadow, could finally sit at the same table. That is rare, that is powerful, that is unforgettable. But it is also destabilizing, because once a person tastes wholeness, the broken way they were living before becomes unbearable to look at. And if they are not willing to do the inner work, they will keep chasing the echo of you instead of facing the emptiness within themselves. This is why some people idealize you after the ending. They do not remember you as human. They remember you as a feeling. They remember the moments when you made them feel chosen. They remember the nights when your words soothed them. They remember the times they could breathe around you without performing. They remember the security, the excitement, the tenderness, the friction, the pulse. But they forget the full complexity of who you were. They forget the ordinary days, the imperfections, the human limitations, the misunderstandings, the places where both of you failed. The unconscious prefers symbols to reality. The unconscious prefers a shining image, because a shining image is easier to worship than a real person. So they do not just miss you, they mythologize you. And once a person becomes a myth in someone's mind, moving on becomes even harder. Because now, every new relationship is measured against an impossible standard. Every new face feels flat compared with the emotional intensity you represented. Every new conversation feels thin compared with the depth they once felt with you. Every new beginning feels like a compromise because the psyche is still standing in the old ruins, waiting for the old fire to return. But fire does not return the same way twice. What burned once may illuminate memory forever, but it cannot always be rebuilt. That is why the path forward must begin with honesty. Honesty says, perhaps they do not miss me as much as they miss the feeling of being understood. Honesty says, perhaps they are not in love with me, but with the version of themselves that loved me. Honesty says, perhaps what binds them to me is not destiny, but unfinished emotion. Honesty says, perhaps the real battle is not between us, but inside them. And that is a liberating realization because it removes the burden of fantasy. It reminds you that you are not responsible for carrying someone else's unhealed psyche on your back forever. You are not meant to become the eternal solution to a problem they refuse to confront. You are not meant to remain a ghost in the hallway of their mind while they avoid the deeper work of self-knowledge. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the cruelest truths in human relationships is this. Many people do not lose you because you were not enough. They lose you because your presence demanded more than they were ready to give. They were not prepared for depth. They were not prepared for accountability. They were not prepared for consistency. They were not prepared to be truly seen. They were not prepared to surrender the comfort of ego for the vulnerability of love. And when someone is not prepared, they may still feel everything, but they cannot build anything. So they let the relationship collapse, and only later do they discover that what they called not ready was really fear wearing a polite mask. And fear is a terrible architect. It builds walls instead of bridges. It protects the ego but starves the soul. It says, leave before you are left. It says, control before you are controlled. It says, disappear before you are truly known. It says, reject before you can be rejected. Many people who cannot move on from you are not simply sentimental. They are defending themselves against the shame of what their fear cost them. Their heart says, go back. Their fear says, it is too late. Their memory says, you felt alive. Their pride says, do not admit what you lost. And the result is a torment of contradiction. That contradiction is what keeps them awake. At night, the mask falls. The performance ends. The ego grows quiet. The unconscious rises. And there you are again, not as a person in the world, but as a presence in their inner theater. They replay conversations. They revisit mistakes. They imagine alternate endings. They wonder whether they were too cold, too proud, too unstable, too emotional, too unavailable, too afraid. They think about the moment they should have spoken, the moment they should have stayed, the moment they should have apologized, the moment they should have chosen differently. And because the mind has no way to rewrite the past, it repeats it. That repetition is what many confuse with love. But what they are really living with is unresolved grief. Grief becomes obsession when it is not honored. Loss becomes fixation when it is not understood. Regret becomes a loop when there is no wisdom to carry it forward. So the real reason they cannot move on from you is not always romance. Sometimes it is psychological unfinished business. They do not know how to let go, because letting go would force them to feel everything they avoided when you were still within reach. And the feeling they avoided may be guilt, or shame, or helplessness, or the unbearable realization that the one thing they wanted most was the one thing they did not know how to hold. That is a heartbreaking thing to learn about oneself. And yet there is dignity in learning it, because once a person sees the truth, there is finally a chance for transformation. Jung believed that the path to wholeness begins not with perfection, but with confrontation. You confront the shadow, you confront the projection, you confront the fantasy, you confront the wound, you confront the fear of being ordinary, the fear of being rejected, the fear of being abandoned, the fear of being insufficient. And only then can love become real. Only then can the heart stop chasing shadows and start building reality. Only then can moving on become not an act of denial, but an act of integration. So when someone cannot move on from you, understand that the story is often much deeper than simple longing. They are dealing with the residue of transformation. You changed them, maybe not in a way they welcomed, maybe not in a way they understood, but you changed them. You interrupted their patterns. You disturbed their comfort. You awakened their unconscious. And what has been awakened cannot be safely ignored forever. It will return in dreams, in regrets, in sudden memories, in random moments of stillness. It will return until it is either mourned, understood, or transformed. That is why some people keep saying your name in their minds long after they stopped saying it aloud. That is why they keep opening and closing the same emotional door. That is why they look for you in other people and find only disappointment. That is why every new connection feels like a pale version of what once burned so brightly. That is why they cannot fully release the past, because they never fully faced what the past awakened. And that is why you linger in their psyche not as a simple ex-partner, ex-friend, or ex-love, but as an emotional landmark. You became a point of reference, a before and after, a threshold. Some people meet you and their life continues unchanged. Others meet you and something inside them cracks open. If you were the second kind of encounter, then your absence will never be ordinary. It will always feel like a missing chapter in their internal book. They may try to deny it. They may try to replace it. They may try to outrun it. But the psyche is patient. The psyche waits. And eventually, in the quietest hour, it asks the question again. What did I really lose? And perhaps the answer is, not just a person. Perhaps they lost a chance to become more honest. Perhaps they lost a chance to heal. Perhaps they lost a chance to meet their own shadow in a loving way. Perhaps they lost a chance to outgrow their fear. Perhaps they lost a chance to experience a love that required maturity instead of performance. And that is why the memory is so hard to escape. Because deep down, they know it was bigger than the ending. Ladies and gentlemen, there is another layer to this truth, and it is one that hurts even more. Sometimes the person cannot move on from you because you represented their unlived life. You represented the self they never fully became, the brave self, the vulnerable self, the disciplined self, the sensual self, the emotionally honest self, the self that could have said the right words, chosen the right timing, made the right sacrifice, and stood firm in love instead of collapsing into fear. When a person sees that possibility in you, they may begin to associate you with the life they wish they had lived. That is a heavy burden to carry in someone else's mind, because now your memory is no longer merely about the past. It is about regret over the future that never happened. And regret is a powerful glue. It binds a person to what could have been. It makes every ordinary day look smaller than the one that got away. It turns maybe into torment. It turns almost into a wound. It turns not now into never again. It turns the heart into a courtroom where the self is both defendant and judge. That is why people become haunted, not because the love was simple, but because the love was intertwined with identity, ambition, fear, shame, desire, and the deepest unmet hunger of the soul. They are not only grieving you, they are grieving the self they might have become with you, the self they failed to protect, and the self they now must confront in your absence. And still there is a strange mercy in this pain, because pain, when understood, becomes instruction. It teaches, it reveals, it strips away illusion. It asks the honest questions that comfort avoids. It demands that we ask not only why we lost someone, but why we needed them so deeply in the first place. It asks us to examine our own emptiness. It asks us to stop blaming the universe for what our own unconscious patterns helped create. It asks us to stop worshipping the memory and start healing the wound. That is the Jungian path. Not denial, not fantasy, not bitterness, but consciousness. Consciousness says, I see what you represented. Consciousness says, I see what I projected onto you. Consciousness says, I see the wound you touched. Consciousness says, I see the part of me that could not let go. Consciousness says, I see the lesson hidden inside the loss. And once that happens, the power begins to return, not necessarily the power to restore the relationship, but the power to restore the self. That is the true victory, because the goal is never to stay trapped in someone else's memory. The goal is to become whole enough that their memory no longer defines your emotional reality, and the same is true for them. If they ever wish to move on, they must do the same. They must stop using your image to avoid their own inner life. They must stop asking your memory to do the work of healing. They must stop treating you like the answer when you were actually the question. They must sit with the discomfort, grieve the loss, admit the fear, and face the self that was exposed in your absence. That is not easy. It is never easy, but it is necessary. Because a person cannot move on from you simply by finding someone else. They move on by understanding what they lost, what they lacked, what they feared, and what they must now become. They move on by grieving the fantasy. They move on by accepting that love without self-knowledge becomes confusion. They move on by accepting that what they called I cannot forget you may in fact mean I have not yet faced myself. And that is the turning point. That is where obsession can become insight. That is where pain can become wisdom. That is where the ghost becomes a teacher. So hear this clearly. If they cannot move on from you, it does not automatically mean they are ready to return. It may simply mean they are finally forced to feel what they once refused to feel. It may mean you mattered more than they knew how to admit. It may mean you exposed the parts of them that were still undeveloped. It may mean you held a mirror they were not mature enough to clean. It may mean you became the symbol of a truth they can no longer escape. And that truth is this: the deepest bonds are not always the easiest to keep, because the deepest bonds demand the deepest self-awareness. There is no shortcut around that. You can distract yourself for a while. You can pretend for a while. You can date for a while. You can perform indifference for a while. You can bury the feeling for a while. But eventually the unconscious speaks. It speaks in dreams. It speaks in silence. It speaks in longing. It speaks in regret. It speaks in the name of the person who changed you. And when it does, all the surface-level lies begin to collapse. That is why your absence is not empty. Your absence is active. Your absence is a mirror. Your absence is a question. Your absence is a test. Your absence forces the other person to confront what remains after the fantasy is stripped away. And what remains is often the self. Not the polished self. Not the social self. Not the self that posts, performs, or pretends. The real self. The self that is lonely. The self that is frightened. The self that is still searching. The self that discovered something true with you and never found a way to make peace with it. That is the real reason they cannot move on from you, not because you were magic in a superficial sense, but because you made the unconscious visible, you made the hidden visible, you made the truth impossible to ignore. Ladies and gentlemen, that is why some people will never forget you, even if they stop reaching out, even if they stop speaking, even if they build walls and call it peace. Inside, something remains unfinished. Inside, something keeps asking your name. Inside, the soul still remembers. And the soul does not forget what opened it. The soul does not forget what broke its defenses. The soul does not forget the person who made it feel real. So let them miss you. Let them remember. Let them sit with the silence they once created. Let them face the shadow they once ignored. Let them meet the regret they once outran. Let them discover that what they thought was love was also revelation. And let that revelation free you from the burden of being only a memory. Because you were never meant to be someone's prison. You were never meant to be someone's unfinished excuse. You were never meant to be the excuse they use to avoid their own growth. You were meant to reveal. You were meant to awaken. You were meant to leave an imprint so deep that the truth could no longer be ignored. And perhaps that is the final answer. They cannot move on from you because moving on would require them to become the person they were supposed to become when they were with you. And that is the hardest work in the world. It is easier to miss you than to mature. It is easier to remember you than to transform. It is easier to idealize you than to integrate the lesson. But until they do, your presence will remain in their mind like an unfinished symphony, a haunting melody, a soft but relentless echo in the chambers of the unconscious. So tonight, if someone still cannot release you, understand the depth of that bond. Understand that you were not merely encountered. You were absorbed into the psyche. You became part of their inner world, and inner worlds are not easily erased. They must be understood, grieved, and integrated. Only then does the heart begin to rest. Ladies and gentlemen, the real reason they cannot move on from you is not a single reason. It is a chain of truths. You were a mirror, you were a trigger, you were a lesson, you were a doorway, you were a disruption to false comfort. You were the face of their unlived truth. You were the memory that would not stay buried because it was tied to their own becoming. And until they face that, they will keep returning to you in thought, in feeling, in silence, in regret, and in dreams. But you must not make yourself smaller to fit into their unfinished story. You must not turn your life into a waiting room for someone else's healing. You must not confuse being unforgettable with being responsible for their pain. You must not let their inability to let go become the measure of your worth. Because the most powerful truth of all is this: when you awaken something real in another soul, it may stay with them forever, but it does not belong to them anymore. It belongs to the lesson. It belongs to the growth. It belongs to the becoming. And if they ever truly move on, it will not be because they erased you. It will be because they finally understood you. It will be because they finally understood themselves. It will be because they learned that love without consciousness becomes suffering, and loss without meaning becomes obsession. So let the silence speak. Let the memory reveal. Let the shadow surface. Let the unconscious confess. And let the truth stand in the light. They're not only trying to move on from you, they are trying to move on from the self they became when they met you. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why they cannot.